So, I showed you REST parameters in the last lecture, so now it's time to talk about default parameters. And default parameters are actually a very straightforward concept. We use them whenever we want one or more parameters of a function to be preset, so we want them to have a default value. So ES6 brings us default parameters, but there is also a way of coding this in ES5. So let's start by doing that. So we haven't used function constructors in a long time, so let's do that now and create a person. Okay, but we create specifically a Smith person, so a person which is a part of the Smith family. So let's call it Smith person, and we want it to have a first name, a year of birth, also a last name, and a nationality. All right. And so we say, as usual, should be the first name that we receive. The last name is, of course, the last name, and the same for the year of birth. And the nationality. Alright, so let's now use that function constructor and create a new person called John once more. So it's a new Smith person. Let's say John and 1990. So JavaScript actually allows us to call any function without specifying all of the arguments. So in this case, we only specify first name and year of birth, but leave the last name and nationality empty. And what JavaScript does in this case is that it simply assigns undefined to these two parameters. So they will be undefined. And we're going to make use of that in a second. I just want to show it to you here in the console. Okay, so let's take a look at John. And so here we see, so last name is undefined and the nationality is undefined as well. So what if we wanted to add a default for the last name and for the nationality? So imagine that we always would call this function constructor like this, only with the first name and the year of birth, and that the last name and the nationality would be default. And we can actually do that and make use of the fact that the arguments that we don't specify will be undefined. And so we can then use an if statement or something simpler like the ternary operator and simply say, if the last name is undefined, then let the last name be Smith, and else it's simply last name, so nothing changes. So let's think about it again. So the variable will be undefined if we do not specify the last name, okay? And so in this case, last name will become Smith. And that makes sense because we say that it's a Smith person here, right? And in case that it's not undefined, then nothing happens. And we can actually delete this part from here. And we'll now do the same thing with the nationality. So if the nationality is undefined, then we want the nationality to be, let's say, American. Alright. And then after that, this part of the code here will execute and do its work. So let's see what happens now. Okay, so we have a small bug here, and the problem is actually that in the ternary operator, we also have to always specify the else part. So let's just say that in this case, it's last name equal last name. So it doesn't make much sense, but we have to put the else part here as well. And so here, let's say nationality is the nationality. Okay. So let's now take a look at John again. And yeah, so his last name is not Smith and his nationality is American. So we only called the Smith person operator function constructor with 2 arguments, but we still have all of these 4 properties of the object well defined because we implemented something similar to default parameters. Now, these can of course be overwritten. So imagine that we have another person, which is Emily, and Emily is John's sister, and she married with someone else and moved to Spain. And so we can now, of course, specify a new last name and a new nationality. So let's say that we have also a Smith person. She's called Emily. Let's say born in 1983. But her last name is now no longer Smith, but Diaz. So she moved to Spain and is now Spanish and no longer American. And so this is going to override the default parameters of our function constructor. So if we now take a look at Emily, of course, the defaults were overwritten and we now have the last name as Diaz and the nationality as Spanish. So this is how we use something like default parameters in ES5. And now we're ready to see how this actually works in ES6, which is a lot easier and straightforward. So now in ES6, all we have to do is, of course, this part is the same. So it's a Smith person. And we have a first name, a year of birth. And now this is where we define the default parameter. So we say that the last name should be Smith and that the nationality should be American if we do not specifically say something else. Then of course this part here is the same. So I will just copy it and that's it. So we don't need any of this part here. All we need to do is to specify the default parameters right here where we actually declare the parameters, okay? So if we now run this and take a look at John, then this is exactly what we had before, but in a better and easier way. So Smith again here, of course, and he is American. And the same with Emily. So we overrode the defaults, and so her last name is Diaz, and she is Spanish, okay? So REST and default parameters definitely makes it easier to work with functions in JavaScript. So they are a very welcome addition to the language. Okay, so let's now move on.